What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today, I'm responding to a video where Standing for Truth apparently responds to me, although it really just ended up being him cutting up a portion of his introductory statement to one of his debates, putting it right after one of my statements, and apparently that's supposed to refute me, even though that was the exact thing that I was refuting. So, let's see what Standing for Truth has got today. Let's see if his little section actually disproves whatever I was trying to say. If you guys are interested in any of Standing for Truth's dumb shit, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens. Well, first, he starts off by playing my particular section, and so we're going to take a look at that. But this entire thing is going over genetic diversity. And basically, the way that I see it is that there's an inherent contradiction with Standing for Truth's position. So let's take a look and see which particular portion he actually has a problem with, and then I'll try to explain myself. It is that two people, Adam and Eve, propagated the entire species of Homo sapiens before a flood wiped out most of the population, and then a population of 8 people then populated the entire world with Homo sapiens. Let's just put the whole minimum viable population of Homo sapiens on the back burner for a second. We don't really have time right now to discuss how two organisms don't really have enough genetic diversity in order to propagate or sustain a substantial population of individuals. Okay, so in that particular section, I was actually saying, hey, let's not concern ourselves with the violation of the minimum viable population for humans, which incidentally is just over 4,000 individuals. That would be the number of people that would need to exist in order for us to stave off harmful genetic mutations. That number of people provides enough genetic diversity in order to do that. Now, there is an inherent contradiction here with Standing for Truth's position, because he has a problem with minimum viable population for like cheetahs of 10,000 or 6,000 or whatever the population of cheetahs is now. He has a problem with that as far as genetic degradation goes, which is a made-up word that he loves to throw around a lot. Basically, he hypothesizes that the genes or the DNA of the cheetahs is degrading in some fashion, which I really don't know how he would gauge that if it's not just by harmful mutations, which they're not accumulating harmful mutations any more so than any other group out there, because they are well above the minimum viable population for cheetahs. This has been thoroughly covered with Standing for Truth. But the inherent contradiction here is that he has a problem with the minimum viable population for cheetahs and humans when we're talking about evolution, but when he talks about his magical God theory, it seems to be a no issue. The minimum viable population for any species is fine. Like, it's just something that doesn't exist. I've never really understood why that was until this video. Alright, so Standing for Truth's response here is to specifically the minimum viable population for humans and other organisms as a refutation to his idea that all life diversified from just 2 individuals or 8 individuals after the flood thing.
Creationists and evolutionists have vastly different explanations for the origin of genetic diversity. I will only briefly touch on the created genetic diversity hypothesis, and will do so by asking, would God have created Adam and Eve with 2 identical versions of DNA, and Eve the same way? If this were the way God chose to do things, Adam and Eve would have created clones. God said, be fruitful and multiply, not be fruitful and clone yourselves. What makes the most sense, both scientifically and theologically, is that God created DNA differences from the start.
No, the Adam and Eve having all of the genetic differences or the potential for genetic differences at the start, and that explains how 2 people could populate the world, does not make scientific sense. This is not a scientific theory. Scientific theories generally don't have a theological aspect to them either. They're Standing for Truth. Basically, what he's saying here is that both Adam and Eve had different DNA, which doesn't exactly make sense. I mean, God pretty much cloned Eve from Adam, why on earth would God take Adam's rib and then fashion a new person and them have a completely separate genetic code? Eve was a copy of Adam, just without a Y chromosome. But Standing for Truth is saying that both of these individuals were created by God and had all of the genetic diversity contained within their DNA, so that when they propagated the species, and under his understanding, mutations and the DNA just sort of shrinks over time and they lose information from their DNA, whatever the fuck they mean by information. And so basically when Adam and Eve mated and had offspring, in order to create all the black people, they would have had to have lost information in order to do it. That's if you think of Adam and Eve as originally being white. But the way that skin color is actually determined in our genes, which we'll get to here in a minute, that would actually not happen. So basically the diversity in humans was all contained in Adam and Eve, and through their propagation, they lost information in their subsequent generations, and that gave us the diversity of humans. The problem with this idea is, though, is that the amount of mutations that we've been able to track and know to have occurred would not have fit into the genome of Adam and Eve if they were humans. So apparently Adam and Eve were some kind of superhuman entities that were not human people, according to him. At least if he were to stay consistent with his idea. They would have to be some other kind of species of hominid that existed and then sort of faded away. I mean, I really don't understand, because the genetic mutations that we know to have occurred over the long period of time that humans have been here would simply not fit in the genome of a human. It's a lot like the TARDIS from Doctor Who. He thinks that Adam and Eve had Tardis DNA. That would be that it's bigger on the inside than it seems on the out. All right, let's see how he explains his Tardis DNA theory.
This is the idea of created heterozygosity. Adam and Eve would have had within their DNA the genetic potential to produce every shade of skin that exists on the planet or known to man.
All right, so he just mentioned the skin tone thing, and basically, from what we understand about skin tone, it's controlled by about 4 different genes. And these genes have different variants. One particular variant of the gene that's most closely related to skin color actually helped the Europeans have lighter skin color, while the lesser expression of another gene made the skin darker. But all this comes down to gene variants and mutations. There was a mutation in the genes that allowed for lighter color skin and darker color skin. So I really have no idea what he means when he says that Adam and Eve were created with all the diversity needed. What would that look like? Are all of these genes just stuffed into their DNA with no way to choose how to express it? Like, did Adam have like all the genes for, super dark skin color and super light skin color? If that were the case, then what did Adam look like? Not to mention that, but all of the other different mutations that we find in humans now, what were their eye color? Because some of the same genes that control skin color also control eye pigment. Mutations have occurred that gave us like blue eyes. Did Adam have blue eyes? Did Adam have some kind of weird color that we can't even describe? The thing is that they cannot describe what it means for them to be created with all this diversity. They cannot actually explain with the DNA how all those genes fit in there, because they would all need to. And then, of course, mutation and genetic drift and just basically how genetics works would have to work completely differently for Adam, Eve, and everybody else that came after that. But don't worry, we'll just throw some magic on this shit and that'll just fix everything right the fuck up. What this boils down to is a magical explanation for something that we know is not magical. Standing for Truth thinks that we lose information over time and that all mutations are bad for us. He neglects to mention the good mutations that do happen that result in new structures, new features, new functionality. Ultimately, what we're getting to here is how do you even determine what is a degradation and what's just a change in the genome? I would love for you, Standing for Truth, to explain to me the difference between just a change in the genetic code and actual degradation of the genetic code.
If these studies she talked about had the assumption that both models predict nested hierarchical patterns, they wouldn't have come to the conclusions that they did. Evolutionists explain the vast majority of DNA differences as a result of mutation, and this is the way that they look at it.
Yes, I would agree. Ultimately, mutation is a primary driver behind evolution, but you also have other mechanisms that help move these mutations in genes throughout a population, like natural and sexual selection along with genetic drift all help genes move throughout a population. So it's not just mutations, it's also the flow of alleles in a population.
This one genetic difference and starting point leads to vastly different expectations and predictions on DNA function and speciation. Every single one of Erica's genetic-related evidence for universal common ancestry that she pointed to in her opening here have been overturned, and I'm happy to discuss every single one of them. The lines of evidence Erica uses are evidence for this model of created heterozygosity. I'm glad she brought them up. Since both creationists and evolutionists expect nested hierarchical patterns in anatomy, physiology, and genetics, and we both expect homologous patterns, and we both expect types of creatures that can best be explained as mosaic or, in a sense, transitional. I can demonstrate that the function of DNA can differentiate between the two models.
Well, see, you can't actually show that it will differentiate between the two models, because if both models predict those exact same things, then you have no way in differentiating them. But on creationism, we should expect to see specially created structures, and we just don't see that. Also, another thing in the evolutionary theories corner is the fact that we can trace organisms back to before they turned into whatever kind you want to talk about. Like, for instance, whales. Whales are my go-to animal because they can be traced back to land quadrupeds. Now, those are radically different than whales and dolphins now. The fact that we can trace whales and dolphins back to land quadrupeds shows that your particular hypothesis here doesn't actually work. Now, if you agree that a land quadruped eventually turned into a whale, then that kind of throws a big wrench in your whole kinds idea, because there's no way that I would lump a land quadruped in with a whale if you're going with the created kinds model. Because even within that particular kind, you have evolution, you have speciation, you have one kind turning into something that looks completely different, which, as far as I can tell, that's exactly what creationists mean when they talk about kinds, is morphologically different. So no, I really don't think that you have the ability to distinguish between the two models given the information that we have. I think all the information that we have definitely suggests that your particular hypothesis, being creationism, doesn't make sense.
The main argument offered, though, by the evolutionist community, especially biologos, against a literal Adam and Eve and ultimately limited ancestry has to do with genetic diversity. They will say there exists no real scientific way for two people to generate all the genetic diversity we see in humans today. This main argument is easily refuted and actually reflects a poor understanding of even basic genetics. A man and a woman today could have thousands, even millions of children, and no two children would be 100% identical.
Did anybody else notice the squirrel in that whole collage of people? It was right in the center of it, so I don't know how he missed it. But in any case, yes, people can reproduce and have a lot of kids. The fact that two people can reproduce a lot and have a lot of kids does not necessarily mean that that is a viable population. It does not have the genetic diversity needed in order for that population to survive long term. Can they survive one generation? Sure. 2 generations? Why not? But at some point, the bad genetic mutations that definitely do occur that affect the viability of a population will build up, and it will kill that population. They would eventually become sterile. They would have so many genetic diseases that they just wouldn't be able to survive. That is the issue. It's not the issue of whether or not 2 people can procreate, even an innumerable amount of times. It's the amount of genetic differences that occur there. Of course, he just throws some fucking magic dust on the issue by suggesting that Adam and Eve had all this created diversity. And that's just an ad hoc argument that's magical as fuck. And also, holy shit, who is this fucking family? Are they part of the Quiverful movement? Jesus Christ. I do like how he's suggesting that like two people produced all of these people in this particular photo. We can obviously see there's a lot of older people there that were definitely not produced by those two old fucks right there. Do you think that maybe he's suggesting that like they all started fucking each other and so this is just a perfect example of how incest can produce like a bunch of shit? This particular picture just raises more questions than it really answers.
This is because they are heterozygous. There exists built-in diversity in millions of sites within the genome of the average person. The best way I can explain it is if God created Adam and Eve to be heterozygous, which in fact would be optimal design, you could have as much human diversity and more than we have today in their first family. Time is not required for the diversity today because diversity can be designed and built into Adam and Eve. This argument is not even scientifically reasonable.
So, last year, Standing for Truth had a really good conversation with this other person named CRISPR. And he points out the problem with this whole magical idea that Standing for Truth has.
You also need bats. You have the bat kind, right, that has to be taken on the ark and then spread out and become all the different species of bat. They need a lot more than 400 variants to account for all of that diversity. They may need as much as 10 times as much, but 10 times as much is bigger than their genome is.
Okay,
That's
so you're
the problem.
Okay, so let's say the ancestors to all modern day bats, okay? Let's say they possessed millions of heterozygous nuclear DNA sites. New species of these bats.
They do now have millions.
Pardon?
They have the same number of variants that we do in proportion to their genome size. But because you're starting with so humans, you're going to start with 2 humans, and you're going to end up with all the modern humans, but all of the modern humans don't have much genetic variance they don't have much phenotypic variance.
Low diversity, low allele, right? Is what you're saying?
I'm saying that humans would need less of this preloaded heterozygosity to explain the current humans, as opposed to if you're trying to explain all of the varieties of bat that we currently see with a single pair of bats, right? Getting all of the modern humans from a pair of humans is a lot easier than getting all of the modern bats from a pair of bats, because there's more diversity in the entire clade of bats than the entire clade of humans.
But what I'm so originally at the creation, you would have created, obviously God would have created these original created, say, let's use a bat kind, for example. It would have just not 2, it would have been a population of them.
But how many bats did Noah take?
Okay, let's say Noah took, let's say he took 2 of each. Okay, so let's say 2 bats. Let's say that some DNA variants were lost, before the flood or after the flood.
You would have needed to start with about 4 billion or so variants.
Okay, now
that's bigger than their genome is.
But if we actually estimate 50 million DNA pre-existing differences created for bats in general, and based on the processes of recombination and gene conversion, you're saying that these new nuclear chromosome combinations will not arise each generation? Like, do you think that's a problem?
What I'm saying is that recombining the order of these genes isn't going to change the phenotype in any great way.
Okay. I get what you're saying. Now, if we're going to produce new species of these bats, obviously these traits and these nuclear DNA combinations, they're going to have to be isolated. So whether it's small population sizes, inbreeding, migration, this can lead to the founding of new, more homozygous populations.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I'm not arguing with that. What I'm arguing with is that you would need to have preloaded into these genomes more variation than the genomes can hold to explain all of the daughter species, right? It is literally impossible.
So in that particular clip, they use the example of bats and how the amount of genetic diversity needed in the original 2 bats that would have existed after Noah's flood, that would be way more genetic material than could be contained in the genome of a bat. So his whole idea here literally makes no sense. Humans, of course, have less genetic diversity than the bats, but that still doesn't really get him closer to his particular hypothesis. While the bats may be more like 10 gallons of water being forced into a 1-gallon bucket, I mean, humans would still be like multiple gallons of water trying to be forced into that same 1-gallon bucket. So, Standing for Truth, your video here really doesn't make a lot of sense. It just shows how magical your hypothesis is at its core. You think that Adam and Eve were created with enough genetic diversity in order to give rise to the diversity of humans that we have today. The problem is, though, like I've said, you just can't get that much genetic diversity in the human genome. Unless you're supposing that these were super duper humans, then you couldn't really call them humans or Homo sapiens, and you gotta kind of question what God was creating. Why don't we find a degrading amount of genetic information as we go through time? I know you'll probably say the information is degrading. Well, first I'd have to ask, what do you mean by information? What do you mean by degradation? What do you mean by is? You won't have good answers for me because all you have are magical God explanations. Well, heathens, that's it for Standing for Truth's video. I do like it when people like Standing for Truth respond to videos or things that I've said, so definitely hit me up if you see any more of these types of videos out there. But I would love to hear what you guys thought down in the comments. Let me know. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.